we haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs.
Very significant market, long-term relationships there. Anything that would impact that is obviously of huge concern.
Canada stares down 35% tariffs from the United States, set to come into effect Friday. One Montreal think tank suggests Canada might benefit from dropping all tariffs unilaterally.
We've taken to calling it the Trump tariff tax because at the end of the day, the end user pays for all of the input costs along the way for these products.
The U.S. and Canada have long shared a relationship that has been built on trade and mutual dependence. For years, the two nations have exchanged goods worth billions of dollars, making them each other's largest trading partners. Among the many exports from Canada to the U.S., one commodity has remained a particularly significant player: potatoes. Whether it's for fast food fries or fresh produce, American demand for Canadian potatoes has been steady, fueling an extensive trade relationship that supports thousands of jobs in both countries. Hit that subscribe button and join the Traveling Vibes family for more incredible journeys around the world. Don't forget to drop a comment below. I'll pin my favorite one. But that relationship has been tested in recent months as Canada, in a stunning and dramatic move, announced a significant cut to its potato exports to the United States. This decision comes in the wake of heightened trade tensions and deepening diplomatic rifts between the two nations, and it has sent shockwaves through the agricultural and political landscape of North America. What was once a strong economic bond built on the trade of potatoes has now become a battlefield for international power plays and retaliatory trade measures. The timing of this decision couldn't have been more striking. It came just as Canada signed a billion-dollar deal with Asia, particularly with key partners in China, Japan, and other Southeast Asian countries, ensuring that Canada's agricultural exports would have access to a rapidly growing and lucrative market. The move to cut U.S. potato exports and focus on this Asian deal sent a clear message to Washington. Canada was no longer willing to be dictated to by the United States and was willing to explore new avenues for economic growth, even at the expense of its long-standing trade relationship with the U.S. For the U.S., this move was both unexpected and alarming. The U.S. potato industry, especially in states like Idaho, Washington, and Maine, relies heavily on Canadian imports to meet the needs of its own consumers and supply chains. In fact, Canadian potatoes have been a cornerstone of American agriculture, particularly in the frozen and processed food sectors, where they play a key role in supplying fast food chains, supermarkets, and restaurants across the country. The disruption of this supply chain sent a ripple effect through the American economy, with businesses scrambling to find alternatives or face the reality of higher prices and slower production. But what prompted Canada to make such a bold and potentially risky move? The decision was not made lightly. Over the past few years, trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada have intensified, with both sides accusing the other of unfair trade practices. From tariffs on steel and aluminum to restrictions on dairy and agriculture, the relationship has been frayed, and the economic repercussions have been felt on both sides. Canada's decision to cut potato exports to the U.S. must be seen in the broader context of these trade disputes and the desire to assert Canada's sovereignty in international trade. In truth, the cutting of potato exports was part of a broader strategy to reposition Canada's economy on the global stage. While the U.S. has been increasingly focused on isolationist and protectionist policies, Canada has made a deliberate effort to diversify its trade relationships, particularly with Asian markets. This strategic pivot is aimed at reducing Canada's reliance on the U.S. as its sole trading partner and opening up new opportunities for Canadian goods and services in rapidly growing markets abroad. The billion-dollar deal with China and other Asian countries is a prime example of this shift. In the face of U.S. tariffs and trade wars, Canada saw an opportunity to build stronger relationships with Asian nations that are eager to import high-quality agricultural products, including potatoes. The deal not only secures new markets for Canadian potatoes, but also lays the groundwork for long-term economic growth in Asia. This is particularly important given the growing middle class in China, India, and Southeast Asia, which represents a huge demand for food products, including processed foods like French fries and potato chips. While the deal with Asia is a major win for Canada, it also has significant consequences for the U.S. The loss of access to Canadian potatoes will not only drive up prices for American consumers, but will also create challenges for U.S. food manufacturers that rely on affordable Canadian imports. Major fast food chains, including McDonald's and Wendy's, could face delays in their supply chains as they struggle to find alternate sources of potatoes that meet their high standards for quality and cost. The disruption to the potato supply chain could also put pressure on American farmers, who may be forced to grow more potatoes domestically, driving up production costs and creating supply shortages in the U.S. market. What's more, the decision to cut potato exports is part of a broader pattern of Canada moving away from its reliance on the U.S. for trade. In recent years, Canada has been negotiating new trade deals with countries in the European Union, Asia, and even Mexico. The agreement with Asia is just the latest in a series of moves that signal Canada's desire to build stronger, more diversified trade relationships beyond the U.S. This shift in strategy has caused concern in Washington, as it represents a significant blow to the U.S.'s position as Canada's primary economic partner. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Canada's decision to cut potato exports is the diplomatic message it sends to the U.S. government. Canada, a country that has long been seen as a close ally and trading partner of the U.S., is sending a clear signal. It will no longer tolerate one-sided trade policies and will actively seek alternatives when the U.S. fails to honor its commitments. The Canadian government has made it clear that it will defend its economic interests and will not back down in the face of U.S. pressure. For President Trump, this move is particularly embarrassing. Throughout his presidency, Trump has prided himself on his America First policies, which have focused on protecting U.S. industries from foreign competition. However, this potato export cut highlights a major flaw in his approach. U.S. trade policies are alienating key allies and driving them to seek out new markets. What was meant to be a strategy of economic strength and self-reliance has instead led to unintended consequences, as former trading partners like Canada begin to look for alternative solutions. The impact on American agriculture is also undeniable. The potato industry, particularly in states like Idaho, has relied on the Canadian market for decades. In fact, Canada is one of the largest buyers of U.S. potatoes, and the sudden disruption of this supply chain will have a significant economic impact. The immediate effects will likely be seen in the form of higher prices for consumers, job losses in the agricultural sector, and a slowdown in production as U.S. potato producers try to adjust to the new reality. The longer-term effects could be even more damaging, as U.S. food manufacturers face a volatile supply of potatoes and the possibility of continued trade disruptions. As the trade war between the U.S. and Canada deepens, it is becoming clear that the relationship between the two countries will never be the same. The potato export cut is just one example of the growing tensions between the U.S. and its neighbors, and it highlights the increasingly fragile nature of the U.S.'s trade relationships. With Canada looking to Asia for new opportunities and the U.S. retreating into its own economic bubble, the global trade landscape is shifting in ways that will have far-reaching consequences for both nations. In the coming months, we can expect further retaliation from Canada, as it looks to assert itself in the global trade market. As Canada continues to build relationships with Asian countries, it may further reduce its reliance on the U.S. for key exports. This could lead to more disruptions in the U.S. economy, particularly in sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and retail. The U.S. government, particularly under Trump's leadership, will have to face the consequences of its trade policies. It remains to be seen whether the Trump administration will be able to salvage its relationship with Canada and whether it will find a way to rebuild trust and cooperation between the two nations. The looming question is whether the U.S. will recognize the long-term cost of its trade wars and shift its approach before it's too late. As the situation unfolds, it's becoming increasingly clear that the U.S. government, particularly under President Trump's leadership, will have to confront the consequences of its aggressive trade policies. The trade war, which initially seemed like a tool for negotiating better deals, has now left a series of challenges in its wake, both domestically and internationally. Canada's decision to cut potato exports and pursue a billion-dollar deal with Asia marks a pivotal moment in U.S.-Canada relations, and it raises critical questions about the future of trade policy under Trump. The U.S. has long considered Canada a close ally and a reliable trade partner. But this series of retaliatory moves shows that the dynamics of North American trade have shifted dramatically. The growing economic strain caused by tariffs, trade wars, and broken supply chains has forced both governments to reevaluate their approach to trade. While the Trump administration may have hoped that the U.S. could go it alone, it is becoming increasingly apparent that the cost of alienating key trade partners like Canada is starting to outweigh the benefits. The most immediate impact of Canada's decision is felt in the agricultural sector, particularly in the U.S. potato industry. With the loss of Canadian imports, U.S. potato producers, especially those in states like Idaho and Maine, are facing a significant downturn in their businesses. The demand for Canadian potatoes in the U.S. has been immense for years, particularly in the frozen food sector, where companies rely on high-quality Canadian potatoes to supply fast food chains and grocery stores. With the supply now restricted, these companies are scrambling to adjust, searching for alternative sources that may not meet their quality standards or their cost structures. As the agricultural industry faces these challenges, the ripple effect is being felt across the broader U.S. economy. The disruption of the potato supply chain has caused prices to rise for consumers, and this is just one example of how trade wars can ultimately harm the very people they are supposed to protect. For average Americans, the cost of living is climbing, especially when it comes to food prices. The potato trade dispute is a clear example of how tariffs and trade restrictions can inflate consumer prices, making everyday products more expensive and less accessible. What's even more troubling is that this issue is not isolated to potatoes alone. It's just one example of how U.S. businesses across industries, from agriculture to manufacturing to retail, are feeling the strain of these trade wars. The construction sector, too, is still reeling from the impact of tariffs on steel and lumber, which continue to drive up the cost of building materials and delay construction projects. These rising costs put pressure on homebuyers and businesses alike, further exacerbating the growing affordability crisis in housing. Thank you for joining us today. What do you think? Will the U.S. be able to recover from the impacts of its trade wars, or will Canada and other nations continue to reshape the global economic landscape? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth analyses of global trade and U.S.-Canada relations. We'll continue to keep you updated as these stories unfold. Until next time, stay tuned for more in-depth insights and analysis. We'll see you in the next video.